All right, so our next speaker I'm really excited to introduce is Nick Valesky, my former student who's now at South Dakota State. Nick, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, like Melanie said, I am an alumni of the Small Farms Lab and Utah State University. I graduated with my degree last summer, and I'm now going to continue working in horticulture and extension here in beautiful western South Dakota. So, I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the research I did in Utah, and that was on season-long Delphinium and Larkspur production. So before I go into details, I just want to give some of the context of why we researched what we researched. So we know in Utah, growers historically have tended to favor warm season annuals because there's a lot of challenges associated with cool season crops. Utah has high elevation and several different little microclimates that can bring a lot of variables like late snow, a relatively short growing season and freeze-free days, and big temperature swings along with intense solar radiation. And usually by the time it's late spring and summer, we have challenges with heat, pests and disease pressure rise. Sometimes we have water restrictions. And a lot of the guidelines from other big production regions like California and Florida, they really don't address Utah's conditions. So we really wanted local solutions with this project. Another thing that we had the lab had studied previously and that we kind of wanted to continue was the use of protected cultivation. So this included high tunnels. We know these increase stem length, yield, and harvest timing. In northern Utah, past studies found that high tunnels could advance peony, anemone, snapdragon, and ranunculus production by almost a month or longer. And then the air temperatures in the high tunnel can really be increased too, and that's important to be monitored by venting. Shade cloth was another protected cultivation measure that we wanted to study. We know that shade cloth in cut flowers can actually reduce the surface temperature, and some species can actually increase stem length. So why Delphinium and Larkspur? So these are two cool season cut flower crops. They're closely related. They're in the family Ranunculaceae, and they had really strong market potential. When we were studying this project in late 2022, there was a really strong demand that exceeded the supply at the time in Utah. So we sent out a survey in the fall of 2022, and we had 62 Utah growers respond. 72% indicated that they currently grow delphinium and larkspur, and then 21% didn't currently grow it, but they had strong interest. So we knew this was definitely a crop worthwhile for our time. So, and we also knew that research was needed to develop reliable production methods that could extend the harvest and boost the yields of these two flowers. So we'll talk about delphiniums and larkspur separately, but we'll start with delphiniums. So as just kind of an overview, like I said, these are short-lived cool season perennials. So I say short-lived because when they're being used as a cut flower, you're intensively harvesting it and cutting it back every season. So it'll only usually last about 1 to 3 years to get optimum yield compared to like a delphinium that you're just growing ornamentally in your yard that can grow several years. The optimum temperature that we found based off literature and industry standards was about 65 to 75 degrees during the day, 58 to 61 degrees at night. Delphiniums are great for their unique shades of blue. They have the tall racemes and they offer that great vertical structure and balance to floral design arrangements. And for this research, we focused on two types of delphinium. So the first I call elatum type. This is the species Delphinium elatum. They have typically are bunched in 5 stems. And then the price per stem could range anywhere from $2.40 to $3.20. And that was just kind of averages range based off local market preferences. And then our belladonna hybrid types. So these are typically bunched in stems or 10 stems. And then it's about $1.20 to $1.60 per stem. So again, we didn't quite have regional production guidelines for delphiniums at the time. So that was something we were hoping to achieve with this research. So the goal I had with delphinium was to assess both high tunnel and field systems for bloom timing, yield, and stem quality of first and second year plants by testing two transplant dates per system. So we looked at late March and mid-April in the high tunnel, and then early May and mid-May in the field. So we looked at three different series of elatum and belladonna types with three color selections in the series. And then we also wanted to evaluate 30% shade cloth, which you can see here in this picture, in the field production and its effect on stem quality. So these are all the different varieties of delphiniums we tested. So in the cut flower space, the term series is usually mostly connected with marketing. So these are just different colors grouped as a series that perform and grow similarly. So we looked at the Magic Fountain series with dark blue, white, and mid blue. The Pacific Giant series had Summer Skies, Galahad, and Bluebird. And then the Belladonna hybrids included Cliveden Beauty, Casablanca, and Blue Donna. So this research was conducted near USU campus in North Logan. We did this in 2023 and in 2024. There was a Millville silt loam soil with 2% organic matter. The hardiness zone was 6A, and there was about 135 freeze-free days from mid-September through mid-May through late September. So we utilized the high tunnel and field space. And then for the data analysis, we used the SAS program primarily. And then with the delphiniums, we wanted to look at the first year production. So we had a high tunnel for 2023 delphiniums. And then the next season in 2024, those then became the year two delphiniums, their second year growth. But then we also did a new tunnel with first year plants in 2024. So we were only comparing first year growth to first year growth. And that was the same story with the field. So here's an image of what plot maps look like. So we divided the high tunnel into 8 different blocks, split between the two transplanting dates, late March and early April. And then each of those blocks had all 3 series equally represented, along with the 3 different colors per series represented. So there's a lot of layers between the planting date, series, and color. But just note that everything was equally represented in the high tunnel. And then out in the field system, we did the exact same thing with the added layer of the shade treatment. So our 3 northern beds had shade cloth applied, that 30%. And then the 3 southern beds had no shade treatment at all. And again, the different transplanting dates, series, and all colors were equally represented. And for the second year in the field, we had a new space. So the design, it's a little different layout, but all the same components. So for delphiniums, we started all our seeds in the greenhouse. So we reference a lot of different recommendations from industries, the Delphinium Society, and different literature on just kind of the best way to start these in the greenhouse. So we found that it helped to chill the seeds 3 weeks prior to sowing them. We used a peat-based media, and we started them in small 128 cell trays, and then we upgraded them to 32 cells about 21 days after initially sowing, or when they had about 2 to 4 sets of true leaves. We maintained that temperature in the greenhouse at 64 to 72 degrees with no day-night differential. They were checked daily, watered as needed, fertilizer was applied, and we added supplemental lights for a total of 16 hours a day. And then, of course, prior to transplanting in the high tunnel in the field, we gave them about a week of a hardening off period so they could adapt to the colder temperatures and the stronger sunlight. So when we transplanted them, we spaced them about 1 foot apart in both the field and the high tunnel. And then we used a horizontal trellis, which we just adjusted in the height throughout the season as the plants got big. And then irrigation occurred 3 times a week. 4 lines of drip tape were laid per bed, about 1.5 feet apart. So the high tunnels, it was important to manage those for temperature. So when the temperature was greater than 40 degrees, we would open the windows. 60 degrees, we would lift the sides, and then 75 degrees, we would lift the sides. 40 degrees, we would open the door. And that was just to prevent it from getting way too hot in there and try to maintain that optimal temperature for the delphiniums. So Kind of a side thing we learned was delphiniums really require a lot of nitrogen. They're heavy feeders. So we kind of modeled some recommendations at about 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre equivalent, and we would split that in three applications throughout the season. So, for example, in the field, we did that mid-May, mid-June, and late July. And of course, we kept an eye on phosphorus, potassium, and iron as well, and that was applied based on soil and tissue test analysis. So for collecting data, we wanted to understand the environmental conditions. So the farm has a reference weather station where we were able to pull air temperature and precipitation data. And then we also use little data loggers to measure the temperature within the canopy of the plants along with in the soil a few inches deep. So that was measured hourly from March through October in both the high tunnel, and then in the field we did it in the no shade system and then the shaded system. So stand counts were important to do. We did that 2 weeks before the first flush and 2 weeks for the second flush. And that was primarily just to give us an idea of the survivability of these plants, but more so to give me accurate numbers to do the calculations about what actually was present and correlate that with the analysis that we did. So when it came time to harvest, we would harvest the plants up to 3 times a week when about 1/3 to 1/2 of the racemes were open. So you kind of see that here in this picture. And then for grading, anything greater than 36 inches we called premium. 24 to 36 was standard. Basic grade was 16 to 24 inches. And then anything less than 16 inches, we considered that whole. Marketable stems were defoliated and we just stored it in the cooler. And we did some market analysis and sold through a local cooperative and other farmers along Wasatch Front markets. The range tended to be about $12 to $16 per bunch. Okay, to save on time, I'm going to skip ahead. So these figures show the cumulative marketable yield measured in stems per meter squared. So that's about equivalent to 1.2 yards squared. And we're looking at the first year plants in 2023 and 2024, along with the second year growth of those original first year plants in 2024 as well, in both the high tunnel and in the field system. So the three different colors of lines, those represent the three different series. So Belladonna, Magic Fountain, and Pacific Giant. The solid line is the earlier transplant date, and then the dashed line is the later transplant date. And then these colored shapes represent the 2 flushes of harvest we got. So the red is the first flush, blue is the second flush. And then the shapes further break it down to when 10% of that flush was harvested, 50%, and 90%. And then we're looking at over the duration of the season. So one of the few first trends you might notice is that the second flush, those blue shapes, was a lot longer and had higher yield than that initial first flush, which makes sense for delphinium. When they first grow and planted, you harvest and cut that first initial singular stem. But after that, typically multiple subsequent stems will grow. So that's why you're getting longer and higher yields. In 2024, the high tunnel harvest was up to 3 weeks earlier than in 2023, and that was due to more hours of optimized temperature for those delphinium plants. And then, of course, you can see how the second year plants in their second year of growth, they had almost 2 times the marketable yield compared to the first year plants. So I had to indicate that this goes up to 70 stems per meter squared. And we also got a lot earlier harvest in the field compared to the first year plants. So this figure, we're looking at the total yield. So it's broken down by color. So dark blue represents premium, then we have standard, basic, and then orange represents coal. Again, we're looking at the total yield in stems per meter squared, comparing the 3 different series within the late March transplant period time and then the mid-April transplant period. So right away, you'll notice that the Belladonna series tend to have greater yields than both the Magic Fountain and Pacific Giant, which are the 2 elatum types. Between those 2 elatum types, there really wasn't significant difference. You'll also notice that the second year growth of the plants, they produce 2 to 3 times more premium stems than the first years. And Of course, we didn't see much significant difference between the transplanting date within the second year plants, which makes sense. By the second year, things have kind of leveled out. So the timing will be more uniform that next year. So we see similar trends in the field. So same layout with the bar graphs. The left side shows the unshaded, and then the right side shows the shaded. So very non-significant. We can't statistically compare the shaded and the no shaded, but visually you can see that there's not much different. The field did have a lot lower yields compared to the high tunnel. But otherwise, again, we see the same trend with the series and transplanting dates in both systems. So kind of in conclusion with the delphiniums, high tunnels were great. They advanced the early season harvest by 2 to 5 weeks with increased yield. We saw about 25.1 stems per meter squared in the high tunnel compared to 8.8 stems per meter squared average in the high tunnel. And improved stem quality was really occurring in the high tunnel as well, where about 31% of them were premium. But the cool thing was, the overall story was combining both those first year and second year plants across both the high tunnel and field system really enabled us to have a consistent stem supply from early May all the way through mid-October in 2024. So that's almost 22 straight weeks of delphinium, which was great to see. And of course, transplanting in late March gave us the greatest yield, stem quality, and projected gross returns. And going forward, it'd be great to further evaluate even possibly earlier transplant dates and to kind of figure out what those lowest temperature thresholds are for delphinium as well. So switching gears, we'll talk a little bit about the larkspur. So I always call larkspur delphinium's kind of smaller, younger cousin. They are not perennials like delphinium. They're actually cool season annuals. And there's a few different species that are utilized for cut flowers. The one I focused on was Consolida adjacis. So their optimal temperature range was about 60 to 70 degrees. And similar with the delphiniums, florists like them for that. They're tall, they offer that focal vertical line and arrangement. And some of the popular colors are the blue and gray hues. So larkspur are kind of interesting because they grow and they have that primary stem that you can harvest. But there's also different secondary stems too that can sometimes be long enough to be marketable and bunched as well. So we would always bunch the thicker 10 primary stems, and those were valued about 90 cents to $1.30 per stem. And then the smaller secondary ones, we would bunch in a bigger number, about 15 to 20, and those would be valued at about 75 cents to $1 per local markets. So with the larkspur to assess both high tunnel and field systems for bloom timing, yield, and stem quality. With the larkspur, we direct sowed and not transplanted. So the direct sow dates were mid-March and late March in the high tunnel system, and late April and early May in the field system. So we also looked at 3 different series with 3 different color selections in each, and then also looked at the shade treatment. So these are the larkspur that we studied. The first was the cane series, which had lilac, white, and deep blue. And then the QIS series included light pink, white, and dark blue. And I really note that visually the dark blue and the deep blue, they give more of a dark purple, kind of an indigo hue instead of a true blue like we saw with the delphiniums. And then lastly, we had the fancy series. So these were kind of the fun color variations. So we had purple picotee, smoky eyes, and belladonna. So same story with the delphinium. In the high tunnel in the field, we had equally represented blocks comparing the 2 different direct sow dates. All the colors and series were equally represented. And then, of course, in the field, we had the shade application on the northern beds and then no shade applied in the southern beds. And they are annual, so we grew them in the same site in both 2023 and 2024. So with larkspur, it is a direct sowed crop. Some farmers might sow it in the fall, others might sow it in the spring. We just, for consistency, focus on spring sowing. And we actually direct sowed it at a 2 to 3 times greater rate than what we were hoping to get. And that was later thinned to get about a target density of 36 plants per meter squared. So as you can imagine, this is really difficult to do. So we're really worried about getting enough germination, but also trying to space them appropriately and getting enough we needed for that optimal clean data set to work with, but that wasn't always the case. We applied the horizontal trellis. Again, that was adjusted throughout the season, irrigated 3 times a week. Nitrogen was applied at an equivalent of 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre across 3 different applications. So in the high tunnel, for example, we did that in mid-March, mid-May, and late June. Um, Phosphorus, potassium, and iron, that was applied based off soil and tissue test analysis. So again, we got our air temperature and precipitation reference from the Greenville Weather Station, and we used those temperature data loggers again in the canopy and in the soil to measure that hourly throughout the Larkspur duration from March through August in both the high tunnel and field systems. Stand counts was especially important for Larkspur because of such a challenge with direct sowing and making sure we have the correct numbers we want. We had to really be precise in counting to make sure I had the best numbers and data for the best accuracy I was trying to get with analysis. So we harvested it 3 times per week, and with Larkspur, the kind of the general recommendations when about 1/4 to 1/3 of the racemes are open. These flowers pictured here might be a little bit past that. For grading, anything greater than 24 inches we considered premium. Standard was about 12 to 24 inches, and then anything less than a foot we considered cool. So once they were harvested, we defoliated. That was especially important for the larkspur because they have a lot thinner leaves and those can get really wet and moist. So it was important to keep that clean and dry. Stored it in the cooler with preservative. And then again, we sold these through local cooperatives and farmers along the Wasatch Front markets. And the bunches ranged anywhere from $9 to $15. So similar figure, we're looking at the cumulative yield and stems per plant this time. So with larkspur, you can see right away that we had a lot greater yield in the high tunnel compared to the field in both years. There really wasn't much difference in terms of series performance. However, you did notice that there was more optimal conditions in 2023, so that's why we got better, higher yields in that high tunnel versus the 2024 high tunnel as well. And then the trend was that the earlier direct sow date tended to have higher yields than the later direct sow date. And that was especially noticeable in the field, not so much in the high tunnel and not so much in the field. Okay, so to save on time, I will just kind of skip ahead to some of the conclusions. With larkspur, I'll just touch on this. We did evaluate kind of the planting density. So because we had a lot of challenges with the larkspur and germination and kind of getting that exact amount of germination per plot, it also gave us a good idea to kind of figure out what the optimal density rates were for larkspur. So the conclusion was that high tunnels were great at advancing the larkspur up to 2 weeks in the field and 2 weeks in the high tunnel and extending it 2 weeks in the field. Direct sowing in mid-March gave us the highest yield, quality, and gross return. We found that the Belladonna Fancy had the greatest survivability and productivity. And with that plant density, we found that 40 plants per meter squared was optimal for the field, and anything less than 36 plants per meter squared in the high tunnel was best. So thank you guys for tuning in, and these are some of the acknowledgements.
Thanks, Nick. It's nice to relive that study. Both of the studies, I think back to 2 years ago with the delphiniums that you achieved a 22-week continuous supply. So you had peaks coming in at late May, mid-June, early July, late July, early August, mid-August, early September, late September, and you were able to keep up with all of them. But then at the same time, learn what combinations could really work to extend these narrow seasons. So thank you for all your hard work on that. Let's see here. So if you have any questions about Nick's study, whether that relates to delphinium or larkspur, we have a little bit of time to answer a few questions before we transition to our next speaker. And I do want to note that not only was this a presentation about Delphinium and Larkspur, but it was also a dabbling into the metric system. And so there are some questions here about talking about that in inches. And I think we could also plug our fact sheets here. There's a Delphinium cut flower production fact sheet as well as Larkspur, and that is all in English units too. But Nick, could you translate what was the ideal spacing for Larkspur in inches?
Yeah, apologies for that. I forgot to convert. So larkspur, the ideal spacing is 6 inches apart. And kind of what we found with the high tunnel too was having them spread out a little bit more was better because they're already in protected cultivation. They're going to grow bigger and stronger. So giving them that extra space is great. Whereas in the field, we could actually do a little bit closer because they're exposed, harder conditions. So having more plants gives you a higher chance of germination and survival as well.
Very good. Thank you. So here's a question, and I know that we didn't test this, but so what would you hypothesize or guess? Do you have any data on third year delphinium, or is it recommended that you plant a new group each year so that you have a consistent supply of first and second year? Do you think third year is possible?
Yeah, I noticed as I was wrapping up in 2025, we weren't formally studying it, but we did have delphiniums coming up as well. So I think the challenge too is if you are extensively harvesting it, that's going to exhaust the plant. So I think the quality at some point will plateau and go down. So it's good to start new plants every year just to keep the cycle going almost, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And one of the things we've talked about here with our plant physiologist is this idea that we're harvesting really heavily from the delphinium. And so that limits the energy that it can put back into their roots. And so we're curious, maybe we could do something where we're pinching the second pruning or the second flush so that the plant is focusing more on rebuilding itself. And we saw a little bit with looking at Nick's second year delphinium where the transplant date that they had the previous year didn't affect their timing the second year, but those that were transplanted in late March had higher yields than those that were planted in mid-April the year before. And so maybe that was because they had more time to grow and put into their root system and so forth. So there's just every time we do a study, there's more information and more questions that I think we want to learn next time.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
there are a few more questions for you, Nick, that are in the Q&A. But if you could unshare your screen, we can have our next speaker start sharing his. And maybe since we have a few seconds left, do you have any tips that you could give for starting them indoors? So I don't know if that refers to larkspur or delphinium.
Yeah, with the delphinium, make sure you really have that perfect temperature range for starting indoors and make sure the light is. And that's a good rule for starting any type of seed indoors is light and temperature.
Good. That's great. Yeah, great point and a good way to end on too. So thanks so much, Nick, for coming back and joining us today. Wonderful to see you.